I don't know if it's the same for you, but in my opinion, February is the month of truth. And I say this because at the beginning of the year, I try to start with many good resolutions. I say to myself, in this new year, I will lose a lot of weight. Then I will read many books. Then I will read the whole Bible twice, and then 1,000 other things. And February is the month of truth, because at the beginning of February, I realized that at least the 90% of what I had planned to do is impossible to achieve. That's a shame, yeah. But this year is different. And it's not just for Finn's kettlebells, but I'm trying to read every day, or at least as many days as possible with Daisy, the 70 resolutions of one of the greatest American theologians, Jonathan Edwards. And he wrote these 70 resolutions to express his desire not to waste his life, but to use it for the glory of God. And it's very interesting to see how it's difficult to put into practice what he says. But it's also very useful to reflect on how I am living my Christian life. And in one of these resolutions, he says, resolved, when I fear misfortunes and adversities, to examine whether I have done my duty, and resolve to do it. And let it be just as providence orders it. I will, as far as I can, be concerned about nothing but my duty and my sin. In other words, what he is saying is that he will try to focus on God's providence and care in difficult moments of his life, trying not to sin. And this makes me reflect. How do I respond to misfortunes and adversities? Do I rest in God's care and providence in bad situations? And today, I want to ask all of you the same question. How do you react to difficulties? When you are afraid of difficulties in life, what is your attitude? How do you respond when you are afraid of death? How do you respond if you discover that you have an illness or that one of your loved ones has one? How do you respond if you lose someone important in your life? How do you respond to difficulties in your family? What is your first thought in these situations? Do you try to be faithful to God with all your strength, or do you try to escape in some way? And these are real situations that we experience in our lives. And I think that it's very difficult to rest in God's care for us. And this is because fear often makes us irrational. And we often make bad decisions because of it. And this is what happens in today's story. We can see that fear leads two people to display a questionable behavior rather than wise behavior. In today's passage, we can see two people who are really scared in two different stories. And we will speak about the priest's fear in the first story and the king's fear in the second one, and how God used these two fears to take care of his anointed one. So we will see God's care through the priest's fear and God's care through the king's fear. And in the first story, from verse 1 to 9, we see a priest who is really scared. But before this, we should remember that King David, the anointed one, the Messiah, is escaping from Saul. In the last few weeks, we have seen that Saul is full of jealousy towards David. We read in chapter 18, verse 7, that the popular song in Israel at that time had these words: Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his tens of thousands. And we read that Saul was very angry about this. And this strong jealousy led him to try to kill David, the man who was anointed by Samuel in chapter 16 and who killed Goliath, the giant, in chapter 17. So David tries to save his life and escapes from him. And from this chapter onwards, we will see that David is in an exodus, in the wilderness. And wilderness doesn't necessarily mean that he was in a desert place, but rather that he was living without a home. And this is strongly connected with the story of Israel. A commentator says that as the wilderness for Israel came before the possession of the promised land, so for David it came before the possession of a promised kingdom. David has already been anointed as king, but he is still waiting to receive that kingdom, the promised kingdom. And while he is waiting, he is in an exodus, fleeing from Saul. And this escape brings him to today's story. David arrives at the city of Nob, which was probably located just northeast of Jerusalem. And in this first story, David goes to Ahimelech, the priest. We read in verse 1 that Ahimelech trembled when he saw David. The priest was very scared of David. And now you may ask, why was the priest so afraid of David? And the name Ahimelech literally means the king is my brother. And in the Old Testament, names were very important. Your name used to reveal your qualities, your story, or other important things about you. And the name, the king is my brother, is a very significant name. This means that Ahimelech wanted to honor and to be loyal to the king in everything. But it's possible that he suspected that there was something wrong between David and Saul. In fact, he asks him in verse 1, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you? There is something strange here, something wrong." David, who is known to be Saul's most loyal servant, is here in front of me. I know who he is. But Saul is the king. What should I do? Should I help David and give him whatever he needs, even if it seems that something is wrong? Or should I be faithful to Saul and oppose David? I think this was the great question that terrified the priest, so much that he trembled, as we read in verse 1. And David's answer is interesting, isn't it? It seems that he is lying. Indeed, David says in verse 2, "The king charged me with a certain matter, a secret mission." And for us, who know that David is fleeing from Saul, we know that this is not true. He's escaping. This is not a secret mission. And there is a debate about it. Some theologians say that he is not lying, but just avoiding the truth. And this is not necessarily a lie. Other theologians say that he is lying because we know that this is not an urgent mission, as David says at the end of verse 8. And I would say that he is lying here, but it's right to think about this, and I invite you to reflect on it. But in either case, we don't know why David behaves in this questionable way. A commentator says that perhaps he was trying to save Ahimelech from being implicated in aiding an enemy of the crown. And I think that this could be possible, but we can only guess. Anyway, what is really important here is that David uses this subterfuge to ask for help from Ahimelech. Indeed, he asks for food in verse 3, And in verse 8, he asks for a sword. And in both requests, Ahimelech, who was very afraid of the situation, gives David everything he needs. He gives David the holy bread. And this was bread that only people from the tribe of Levi, and in particular only priests, could eat. But David is not a priest, and he's from the tribe of Judah. He couldn't eat this bread. Ahimelech was bending the rules by giving David this bread. In fact, we read in Leviticus 24 that only Aaron and his sons, and therefore the priests, could eat this bread. And we also read that this was a perpetual due, a lasting covenant, an eternal law. But here, a non-son of Aaron is eating this bread. And we can see that this is a story that raises many questions. David is not completely honest. Ahimelech is not totally faithful to the law in order to help David. What is happening? And what this story wants to underline is the providence of God in the life of David. God is giving David everything he needs to preserve the life of his anointed one. In fact, we can also see that Ahimelech gives David the sword of Goliath, the giant he killed. And this shows us that God is sovereign over the world. The creator of the world rules the world. The creator of the law is above the law. God can use questionable situations like this to bring glory to his name and to carry his plan forward. And this is what Jesus says. In Matthew 12, Jesus talks about this story of the consecrated bread to explain to the Pharisees that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And what he says is that he can do whatever he wants on the Sabbath. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the Lord of the law because he is God. And God can use the law however he wishes, obviously in keeping with his righteous character. And as we know, God cannot sin, but in some way he can use these dubious actions of David and Ahimelech to carry his plan forward. In fact, God provides for his anointed. And Ralph Davis says that this holy bread was a quiet witness that Yahweh sustains his people and supplies their needs. And just as this bread was a witness of God's providence for the people in the Exodus, in the same way, it is a means God uses to provide for the needs of his anointed David in his Exodus. And obviously, God does not accept sin at all. But he can use sinful situations to carry his plan forward because he is sovereign over the world. And in a way that is difficult for us to understand, he can use sinful situations without being responsible for sin. And this is because he is sovereign over everything. And this is what this story tells us. But according to his sovereign plan, in this passage, there is another detail. It's interesting to notice that now the camera moves to another scene. If this were a film, there would be a suspenseful soundtrack while the camera shifts to another character. In fact, we read in verse 7 that one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord, and he was Doeg the Edomite. And at first sight, this may look like a useless detail, but actually, this man, Doeg, will be responsible for terrible things that will happen to the priest Ahimelech and his whole family in the next chapter, because he helped David. And David will later say that he is responsible for what is going to happen to the priest. But no spoilers. If you want to know what will happen, come back next week. Anyway, what we can see in this story is that God uses the priest's fear to take care of his anointed one, providing for his needs in the wilderness. But now, from verse 10, we come to another story in which we see God's care through the king's fear, the fear of King David. And I say this because David, in his escape from Saul, goes to Achish, king of Gath. And the servant of this king recognized him. David was famous, and the song about him and Saul was famous as well. We read in verse 11, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his 1,000, and David his tens of thousands." This song was a very popular song at that time. It was like Abba's Mamma Mia of that era. Everybody used to sing it. And this is why they recognized David. And it's interesting to notice a little detail here. In all these chapters, David is fleeing from Saul. We saw that Saul tried to kill him many times in the previous chapters. And as Graham said, it's interesting that it was Saul who was afraid of David. And in all this chapter, it's never written that David was afraid. Of course he was, but it's interesting that after all these events, the first time we read that David was afraid is in verse 12 of this chapter. We read that David took this word to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. But why was he so scared? And it seems that he hoped not to be recognized. In fact, he was very afraid after they recognized him. He had killed Goliath, who was from Gath, and in chapter 18, he had killed 200 Philistines. That was not the best place to be recognized. And this is why he was so scared. And what does David do because of his fear? Verse 13, he pretended to be insane. Here again, David is displaying a questionable behavior. And he changes his behavior in order to preserve his life. And he succeeded. King Achish, seeing David, says to his servant, verse 14, "Look at this man. He's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?" And obviously, this is a rhetorical question. And the answer is no. This man will not enter in the house of King Achish. David is safe. And we read at the beginning of the chapter 22 that he leaves Gath. And now you might ask me, so, is it right to behave like this to save our lives? Can I make compromises when I am afraid of difficulties around me? Can I adopt David's attitude if it saves me from my difficulties? This is a very good question, but also a very difficult one. Some people think that David's behavior is justified because he's not condemned for his action. But there is a debate also about this. Is it possible to lie to our enemy to preserve our lives? Or should we always tell the truth? These are very important questions, and I think we should reflect about them. On the other hand, it is not the goal of this passage to give us principles about lying or telling the truth. As a commentator says, we can understand David's difficulties, but that does not justify his behavior, however. The text is not recommending David's conduct, only reporting it. It may describe what he did, but does not care to discuss it. So, we are not justified in deciding not to tell the truth just because David did it in this story. Because this passage doesn't give us a moral principle. What it does is simply report what happened. But the real question we should ask at this point is, why? Why is this story here? Why does God want us to read this story? And as we saw in the first story, God takes care of his anointed one, even in his questionable behavior. God delivered David, even though he lied to the priest, even though he was acting like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. God took care of his anointed one because this was his plan. God takes care of his children. He will be glorified even in our mistakes. And this is not a justification for foolish behavior, but as Ralph David said, we should never forget God's mercies given us even in our foolishness. As we read in Deuteronomy, God took care of his people in the Exodus. In the same way, he took care of David in his wilderness. And the same God takes care of his people today. God takes care of the church. So, if we are children of God, he will take care of us, always, even in difficult moments of our lives. God is taking care of you if you are suffering. And this doesn't necessarily mean that he will deliver us from every challenge, but even amid suffering, he cares for us. In our Exodus, waiting for the new Jerusalem, God takes care of us. But this is possible only because his perfect Son, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, came for us. And thanks to his perfect work, we can experience salvation in our sinful lives. And we can experience the care of God. We've seen that the Messiah, David, the anointed one, was in front of the king, acting foolishly, like a madman. David was trying to save his life at all costs. But the perfect Messiah, Jesus Christ, in front of the nation, in the Sanhedrin, while they were accusing him falsely, remained silent. He remained sane from the start to the end. Jesus was silent and ready to lay down his life for our sake. And this is our Savior. So, how do you respond to misfortunes and adversities? How do you react to difficulties in your life? If you are going through a hard time because of illness, loneliness, challenges, etc., I encourage you to remember that Christ, the perfect Son of God, died for you. And if you are a child of God, remember that. We can trust that this is the perfect care of God for us. He provided for our greatest need, the salvation from our sin. And that is everything we truly need. But if you are not yet in a relationship with him, I invite you to reflect. Please reflect on what it means to experience the perfect care of God in our lives. A care that you can truly experience only if you put your faith in the perfect work of Jesus Christ, who has renounced the perfect care of the Father for the sake of his people. And you can be part of these people. And for us who are in Christ, we are part of his people. What an amazing joy to experience the perfect care of God for us. Let's pray.